Turn your eyes to the energy veins that turn China's massive industrial wheels, to the warm waters of the Middle East. Because right now, the silent chess game being played in the Strait of Hormuz is directly rewriting Beijing's fate. The Tehran regime thought it could still supply oil to Beijing through the strait, which it had closed for the second time since April 18th. However, the US broke this taboo once again by seizing yet another new ship, allegedly carrying Iranian oil to China. Washington, only 48 hours after the seizure of the Tuska, stopped a massive ship named MT Tiffany this time, belonging to the shadow fleet used by the Tehran regime in the region. This stunning operation took place in the pitch-black waters of the Indian Ocean on the night of April 21st. Having loaded a full 1.9 million barrels of crude oil into its hull from Iran's Karg Island, the massive ship had set out on a covert route toward China. The Tiffany, a vessel of the sanctioned shadow fleet notorious for frequently swapping flags, thought it had successfully breached the US blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, and it assumed that the black gold, destined to keep China's industrial wheels turning, would arrive safely. The tanker had advanced deep into the Bay of Bengal, between Sri Lanka and Indonesia. Just as the captain thought he was safe in the middle of the ocean, a surprise airborne force descended from the sky. The breathtaking operation footage released by the US Department of Defense laid bare the whole truth. US Navy SEALs, among the world's most elite special operations forces, were on the scene, fast roping from helicopters that had launched from the mothership USS Lewis B. Puller. These special operators made a pinpoint landing via ropes onto the deck of that massive tanker in the pitch black of night. Within seconds, without a single shot being fired and facing absolutely no resistance, the massive vessel was completely seized. The official message the Pentagon delivered to the entire world that night, but primarily to Beijing and Tehran, was chilling. International waters are not a safe haven for sanctioned ships. The US military is no longer just waiting in Hormuz to prevent China from getting its hands on that oil. They are starkly proving that they will shatter those maritime networks by hunting down these ships wherever they may be in the world, even in the middle of the ocean. While this incredible operation by the US shook the entire agenda, another shocking piece of news came from Iran for China. The Tehran regime claimed that it stopped the passage of Chinese ships through the Strait of Hormuz. One of these ships, the Sun Prophet, was denied passage by Iran while approaching the Strait of Hormuz. It was confirmed that the ship made an abrupt U-turn and changed its course. Iran's official consular channels then shared the following shocking statements. "We did not grant passage to a Chinese vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. Contrary to popular belief, Iran does not give blanket approval to all Chinese ships." Tehran is essentially confronting Beijing in the Strait of Hormuz, which it viewed as its closest ally. But this is not the only shocking move for China. She experienced a second striking surprise in the Strait of Hormuz, with the United States continuing its naval blockade during this critical period. The formidable steel wall of US warships has turned the Strait of Hormuz, the most vital windpipe of the Chinese economy, into a virtual dead end. This flawless siege, which punishes Iran on paper, has actually surrounded China with a ring of fire in the region without firing a single missile. Because nearly 90% of Iranian oil was being transported to China through the Strait of Hormuz, Beijing-owned ships, carrying millions of barrels of oil, are now facing the massive naval power of the US in the strait. This scenario, perhaps anticipated for years, is unfolding in the warm waters of Hormuz, brought to a boiling point by the crisis. The scene waiting for the Chinese ships in the strait is terrifying. More than 15 US warships and over 10,000 US troops have turned Hormuz into a virtual dead end. All Chinese ships trying to load oil from Iranian ports and set sail into the strait are on the radar of the naval vessels Washington has lined up in the region. This massive armada, led by the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, is monitoring every breathing floating element in the region in real time. In other words, the United States Navy has built a literal wall of steel against every single element trying to breach the blockade in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. This is no ordinary patrol. It is a massive military nervous system, weaving a digital web above and below the sea. Chinese oil ships are practically trapped in the Strait of Hormuz between the US Navy and Iranian ports. However, Beijing's energy bridge traffic with Tehran is also being entirely tracked from the sky. F/A-18 Super Hornet fighter jets and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, constantly patrolling areas near the airspace of Hormuz, instantly relay every surface movement to the U.S. command center. MQ-4C Triton drones, flying at thousands of meters high, instantly detect even the slightest heat source, ending the smugglers' hopes before they even set sail. This massive and flawlessly operating military mechanism has placed Iran, and subsequently China, right on the target board. But what if we told you that despite this heavy blockade, China is still desperately trying to get its ships out of Hormuz to procure oil from Iran? Yes, you heard that right. As global markets shook from the moment the US blockade began, the massive oil tankers known as China's Shadow Fleet entered a desperate effort to breach this wall of steel. These ghost ships were trying to hide in the dark by turning off their signaling devices called transponders, playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse on illegal routes. Because massive China-linked tankers had to take that black gold keeping Beijing's industry afloat from Iranian ports and deliver it to the mainland. One of the most important ships to step onto the stage during this process was the rich Starry tanker, owned by the China-based Shanghai Zhuanrun Shipping Company. Carrying roughly 250,000 barrels of Iran-linked chemical cargo, this massive ship entered an extremely risky route to navigate around the blockade. The ship's captain had hoped to move silently in the dead of night, thinking he had found the blind spots of American radars. The rich Starry began to glide silently off the coast of the United Arab Emirates toward the narrow and dangerous waters of the Strait of Hormuz. At first, this shadow tactic seemed to be working, and the ship briefly managed to make an exit toward the Gulf of Oman. However, they would soon realize that this temporary success was actually a deliberate wait by the American Navy, because it is not that easy to escape the advanced radar network and satellites of the U.S. Navy. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Spruance, one of the most dangerous hunters of the seas, instantly cut off the Chinese tanker's route. The officers on the destroyer's bridge were watching their targets second by second on their digital screens, setting a flawless trap for the Chinese oil ships. The American destroyer readied its massive barrels and guided missiles to fire, issuing an extremely harsh warning to the rich Starry over military radio frequencies. This warning was not a recommendation, but a strict order, implying the ship could be directly struck if not obeyed. Those cold commands echoing from the radio were enough to freeze the blood of the entire crew on the Chinese ship. The massive China-linked tanker, thinking it had breached the blockade, was forced to make a dramatic U-turn within minutes in sheer desperation. The tanker turned around with its enormous bulk and practically fled back along the route it came from, retreating toward the Iranian shores. But the rich Starry is not the only ship experiencing this despair. Other China-linked giant tankers, such as the Merlikishan and the Peace Gulf, also tried their luck toward the dangerous waters of Hormuz, only to share the same fate. As part of the Shadow Fleet, these ships were desperately looking for a weak spot, dreaming of smuggling billions of dollars worth of oil to Asia. Following different routes, each hoped to slip past American radars by hiding in the dead of night or amid heavy maritime traffic. But the power standing against them is the most sophisticated naval force in the world. U.S. naval forces were leaving absolutely no gap in Hormuz for Chinese oil tankers to pass through. Everything from satellites in space to submarine sonar networks had turned this region into the most surveilled body of water in the world. Every Chinese tanker approaching the Strait of Hormuz was startled by the cold radio announcements of American destroyers appearing before them like ghosts. No physical operations were conducted on any ship, nor were troops deployed, because the mere presence of American warships in that area was enough to frighten these giant tankers. All Chinese ships that received the warning pushed their engines and changed their course from the Gulf of Oman back toward Iran's dead-end ports. As compasses inevitably pointed to a return, Beijing's energy security was sinking into the waters. The millions of barrels of oil that would turn Beijing's industrial wheels were trapped in the middle of the sea in the shadow of American warships. Kharg Island, one of the biggest hubs feeding China's energy veins, began to experience the greatest state of paralysis in history right during this process. This legendary deepwater terminal, which shoulders 90% of Iran's oil exports, faced the most ruthless consequences of the American blockade. Yet, until just before the crisis, This port was a trade center where pumps worked non-stop and millions of barrels flowed to China. That bustling port, where massive VLCC supertankers docked to load millions of barrels of oil, turned into a virtual ghost town. Oil storage tanks were filled to the brim, and the pressure in the pipelines had reached dangerous levels, because the produced oil has nowhere to go. On the other hand, it wasn't just Karg Island. The strategic Chabahar port, frequently used by Chinese ships, also became one of the points affected by the US blockade. American destroyers are keeping such a tight grip on port exits that not even a single barrel of oil is allowed to sail into international waters. This interruption at sea has turned into a horrific economic tremor on land, cutting off Iran's daily cash flow of millions of dollars like a knife. Bandar Abbas, Asaluya, and the Shadow Fleet's hidden paradise, Larak Island, have also become completely dysfunctional under this steel siege. Ships trying to enter the ports are blocked, while those inside that have taken their cargo and are waiting to exit wait helplessly like trapped rats. The massive maritime traffic that once fed Asian markets now resembles a silent junkyard where only seagulls fly. Due to this horrific siege, there is currently not a single new ship setting out from China to pick up Iranian oil, because the Beijing administration knows very well the futility of knowingly sending these ships, which have massive naval costs, into a dead end. Without firing a single bullet, the United States is succeeding in blocking China's most vital energy bridges with Iran, one by one, in the Strait of Hormuz with its massive navy. So how did China react to taking such a heavy strategic blow and having the lifeblood of its economy severed? Contrary to expectations, the response China, possessing one of the world's largest armies, could muster on the ground remained quite feeble and faint. Beijing's strong naval and air power trump card was practically torn to pieces in the face of this massive American firepower, stretching from the Pacific to the Middle East. Because the presence of the Chinese Navy in Middle Eastern waters is not at a level to challenge such a massive American armada. The few frigates and logistics ships stationed at Beijing's military base in Djibouti would be making a move no different from suicide to breach the American wall of steel in Hormuz. When Chinese admirals looked at the maps, they probably realized very bitterly just how vulnerable they are across the ocean. This lack of power on the seas pushed the Beijing administration into inaction on the ground, confining their reactions solely to diplomatic corridors. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs made back-to-back harsh statements, characterizing the blockade as dangerous and irresponsible. Beijing's diplomatic channels are calling the international community to duty, arguing that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to global trade. However, these complaints echoing in the halls of the United Nations do not create even as much impact on the ground as the radar waves of American warships. Although the Chinese Minister of Defense issues tough statements, declaring their energy deals should not be interfered with, not a single Chinese warship to protect Chinese ships is seen on the horizon. Pushed to the brink of an energy crisis, China was condemned to desperately drain its strategic petroleum reserves and seek alternative routes with rising costs. Small Chinese oil facilities, known as independent teapot refineries, entered a period of severe turbulence due to rising costs. Unable to respond militarily, China's hands were tied, and its industry was abandoned to the mercy of American warships. On the flip side of all this chaos and crisis, a virtual golden age is being experienced for the United States. Unlike China, which is trapped in Hormuz, the US is emerging from this process with an incredible oil and energy victory. The crisis has transformed not only into a political trump card, but also into a massive multi-billion-dollar syringe injected into the American economy. With the blockade wiping Iranian oil off the market, a massive void formed in the global oil supply, and prices began to climb rapidly. Right at this point, the American energy sector took the stage to fill this massive void. Unprecedented activity began at the Gulf ports along the coasts of Texas and Louisiana. While Iranian ports fall into a dead silence, the cranes and pumps at American ports are working non-stop, 24/7. Fleeing the dangerous waters of the Strait of Hormuz and not wanting to get caught in the blockade, hundreds of massive supertankers rapidly diverted their course to the United States. For the month of April, more than 70 massive VLCC supertankers scheduled entries into American ports to load up. It was also reported that, within the scope of this plan, Similar traffic could be experienced in U.S. ports in May. Each of these ships is becoming a floating symbol of American power that will flow into world markets. Meaning, while there is a dead silence in Hormuz, the ports of Houston and Corpus Christi are overflowing with massive ships coming to buy oil. The Washington administration is both suffocating its biggest rival, China, with the military blockade it has established, and earning billions of dollars in revenue by pushing its own country's oil exports to record levels. Right at the heart of this perfect storm lies the incredible and cold-blooded betrayal strategy displayed by Russia, Iran's closest ally on paper. While the international community expects Moscow to break the blockade by providing massive military and diplomatic support to its ally Tehran, the Kremlin is after an entirely different calculation. For it seems the Kremlin has adopted the ruthless strategy that states do not have friends, only interests. And Putin is putting everything he can on the field to turn this reality in his favor. The blockade's sharp upward pull on global oil prices became practically a miracle sent from above for the Russian economy, which is being crushed under the costs of the Ukraine war. Vladimir Putin not only watched Iran's agonizing struggle, but also rolled up his sleeves to reap an incredible profit from this crisis. Iran's closed valves prepared the perfect ground for Russian oil wells in Siberia to operate at full capacity. In just 1 month, thanks to rising prices and new demands that China desperately turned to, Russia's oil revenues doubled. The Russian economy began filling its coffers by securing a massive additional revenue of exactly $19 billion from this turmoil. This massive capital flow became the biggest lifeline financing the Kremlin's war machine. Although the Moscow administration condemns the blockade in front of cameras and broadcasts messages of diplomatic support for Iran, on the ground, it has completely abandoned Tehran to its fate. Because the Kremlin knows very well that China's inability to reach Iranian oil will make Beijing entirely dependent on Russian energy. It looks as if Beijing is now forced to turn its face from the Middle East to the north, to Russia's icy geography, for energy security. While Russian ships meticulously stay away from the dangerous waters of Hormuz, the Kremlin continues to sell its oil at record prices through safe northern routes. Putin's ruthless strategy once again bitterly proves to the whole world that in geopolitics, there are no permanent friendships, only permanent interests. So, as we can see, the final picture is beginning to become quite clear with each passing day. Everyone plays a different role on this chessboard that the US has set up with its naval power. The situation of the thousands of kilometers away Chinese factories, which are the real target, is heartbreaking. The smoke billowing from massive chimneys is decreasing. Every American flag waving in the Strait of Hormuz means Beijing becomes a little more breathless, slowing down a little more. And in this new geopolitical chess, there is no longer a need to fight to checkmate the king. Because cutting off the opponent's windpipe, namely their energy supply routes, is more than enough. The interesting part is that by blocking the passage of Chinese ships in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is essentially creating an effect on Beijing similar to the US blockade process. As a result, this unilateral blockade that started in the warm waters of Hormuz is not just a fight over billions of dollars worth of oil barrels. This situation could also be a definitive declaration of whose rules the future world order will be written by. The reality that the power ruling the global oceans indisputably rules the destiny of nations and the flow of history has once again been indelibly engraved in the memory of the entire world. So, what do you guys think about this issue? We are waiting for your comments. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.